Well, hello there again. Social Studies 30-1. I'm going to take a quick look at the Indian Act of 1875. This is, of course, is a Canadian e-liberal policy. You may have learned this back in 10-1, although odds are you learn more about residential schools, and that is certainly part of the Indian Act. The Indian Act did establish the residential school system for First Nations peoples, but there was more to the Indian Act than just that made it illiberal. And so, just reading along with what I've got on the screen, it was intended to compel, to get First Nations peoples to renounce their Indian status and join Canadian civilization. We call this process enfranchisement. When you're enfranchised, you become a legal citizen of a country. You can vote and you've got the rights and freedoms that go with being a citizen of that country. But in this case, under the Indian Act, First Nations peoples had to give up their Indian status. So, just ponder that for a few seconds. They're being asked to give up their heritage, their culture, their language, their religion, their identity, their way of life to become a Canadian citizen, to become enfranchised, which makes no sense now in that you should just get those rights for being a Canadian citizen. You shouldn't have to give up who you are to get those rights. I mean, after all, during this whole time from the establishment of the Indian Act in 1875 and on, immigrants could come to Canada from other countries and not have to renounce their heritage, culture, and so on to become Canadian citizens. First Nations peoples were not given that right. They were not given that possibility. That makes it illiberal. Indian Act also restricted First Nations peoples from leaving the reserve without permission from their Indian agent, who basically was kind of like a babysitter for First Nations peoples living on the reservations. Imagine that. You've got to ask permission as a grown adult to leave the reserve to visit family, friends, shop, whatever it might be. Um, if First Nations peoples did not renounce their Indian status, they were not given the right to vote. They were denied the right to vote until they gave up the status, which is also a clearly illiberal measure. The permit system was established. What this meant, I got this from an article I'd read a few years back. I was surprised in that the government encouraged First Nations peoples to move to these reservations, gather in them, and farm and make a living that way. But before they could sell their products, they needed basically permission from the Indian agent to sell their produce that they grew on the farm and rightfully belonged to them and was theirs to do with whatever they pleased. Um, First Nations peoples were forbidden, banned from forming political organizations, another clear illiberal measure in Canada's past. And of course, the residential school system, which you would have learned in 10-1, is an illiberal act. And finally, just a couple more specifics you might want to ponder. The banning of the potlatch and Sundance, which were First Nations traditional uh, cultural practices. So the potlatch was a gift-giving ceremony practiced among First Nations peoples of the West Coast in Canada. The Sundance was a religious ceremony, a cultural ceremony practiced by uh, the Great Plains First Nations in Western Canada in both cases, and more than just that. Those are just two examples. But in those cases, the government banned the practice of such traditions and religious practice. Very obvious illiberal measures. It's hard to believe that happened in Canada's past, like I'll talk about in the source analysis later on in this lesson. When we think of Canada, we think of a very liberal, forgiving, progressive nation, and we read about these things in our past, and I'm very shocked that this happened in our past, but it did. And if it happened in Canada, it's happened in other democratic countries too. The importance is that we make restitution for it, we atone for it, and we make sure that it doesn't happen again in Canada. So thanks for listening to that. We've only got a few more examples we're going to study of illiberalism. The unit mini unit is coming to an end. We still need to look at women's suffrage. We'll talk about eugenics. Geez, that should pretty much be it. Of course, you've been learning about civil rights as well this week. And last week we learned about internment. We learned about specific examples of Canadians who lost their rights and freedoms. You have a plethora now of examples of case studies of illiberalism in action in Canada's past. That should be it for today.